Hello listener. The fact you hear this means you're alive. If you're new here, consider subscribing and comment below where you're listening from. Let's begin the story. My name is Marcus Reed, and the only reason I'm still breathing is because the harbor didn't swallow everything. I'm 40, give or take a year. The calendar stopped mattering around the time the first sirens wailed and never shut off. Before all this, I worked down here on the water at a small freight yard on the edge of a coastal town most maps overlooked. I fixed winches, checked mooring lines, moved pallets, and kept old boats running. The dockhouse I'm sitting in now used to be a joke. It was a cramped office with bad coffee, warped floorboards, and a radio that crackled through half the weather reports. It stands on concrete pilings at the end of a short service pier with one narrow ramp from the parking lot and a ladder to the water on the far side. From the road, it never looked like much. Just a box with peeling paint and a crooked sign that once read Harbor Services. Now it's my bunker and my line in the sand. When the outbreak started, people ran for hospitals, highways, and open country. On the first day, as the news anchors began repeating the same words in tight, scared voices, I already knew two things. 1. Crowds don't save you when the danger moves faster than information. 2. The water isn't your friend or your enemy. It's a barrier you learn to use. This dockhouse sits at the edge of a shallow inlet with the main harbor to the west and a breakwater that blocks most of the swell. Empty warehouses line the shore behind me. Glass blown out, doors hanging, forklifts sitting where drivers stepped out and never came back. Out on the channel, rusted buoys still knock against their chains when the tide changes each day. I chose this place because it's small, hard to approach in numbers, and boring to anyone who still thinks like the old world. No one looked twice at this office when the docks were busy. And that's why I'm still alive inside it now. The first real sign that something was wrong didn't come from the news. Instead, it was the yard gate that refused to shut one Tuesday night. The motor kept grinding while the metal rolled back and forth, and the guard, who usually kicked it into place, just stood there with his hands at his sides. When I walked over and told him the gate was stuck again, he turned toward me like he heard the sound, but not the words. And there was a thin gray sheen at the corner of his mouth that didn't match the cold air. By the time I reached him, he was already gone in the way that matters. His eyes followed motion, but not meaning. And when I said his name again and reached for his shoulder, he snapped at my arm with his teeth. I pulled back on instinct and saw the strip of skin missing from the inside of his own wrist, where he'd chewed himself raw, trying to scratch an itch he couldn't reach. The news had been talking all week about a fast-spreading flu and crowded hospitals, about one city after another asking people to stay home and give the system time to catch up. But those places were always somewhere else. That night, after they pulled Dale away from the gate and called for someone who never arrived, management sent us home and told us to hold for updates. At home, I watched the same shaky clips loop on 3 channels until the power cut out and the house fell quiet in a way neighborhoods aren't supposed to. The next morning, I came back to the water because the house felt smaller with every siren. The main yard was locked, but the side lot where the dockhouse sits was open. There were no trucks, no voices, no forklifts beeping in reverse, just the slap of water against the pilings and the wind knocking a loose sign against the wall. The dockhouse door was unlocked and the radio on the shelf still had power from the emergency circuit, and I turned it on and walked the dial. The regular hosts were gone, replaced by flat voices reading bullet points about public safety and shelter-in-place orders. One station tried to sound calm and called it a temporary disturbance. Another let the fear leak between the words. They all leaned on the same 2 phrases until they blurred together. Outbreak. Stay back. They talked about patients who wouldn't stay down after they collapsed in waiting rooms and about police lines that broke when someone in the back row turned on the person next to them. Every story had the same simple shape. Tight rooms, scared people, one wrong move. I looked out through the dirty glass at the inlet and thought about what the land offered. The road out of town ran past the hospital, the mall, the bus depot, and the big gas station, places everyone would rush to first. The only other way out was the 2-lane bridge to the north, and I knew from storm evacuations that it would jam solid the moment fear and rumor met at the same intersection. Out on the water, a few small boats still sat on their moorings. And this little office stood on concrete legs 20 yards from shore with deep mud on each side, and only one narrow ramp where anything on 2 legs could reach me. I'm not a soldier, and I never trained for any kind of end-of-the-world plan. Sitting at that cheap metal desk, listening to strangers repeating outbursts into microphones in a city I would never see again, I understood something simple. Anywhere people rushed to in groups wasn't where I wanted to be. The dockhouse had one door, 4 windows, a hatch to the roof, a ladder to the water, and a breaker panel I could reach without asking anyone's permission. That was enough of a start for that day. So, I locked the door from the inside, killed the lights, and took the first careful look at the building that was about to become home for now. Anyway, the first hours alone in the dockhouse felt like waiting out a storm that might never truly arrive. I walked the room, a restless perimeter, and touched every rough surface. Not because any touch changed a thing, but because it helped make the place feel a little more like mine, a space I could claim. One main room held desks and a counter. A storeroom was stocked with shelves. A closet with life jackets and rain gear was tucked away. A ladder led up through a hatch to the roof, and a second ladder bolted to the far wall, dropped straight down to the water. If you want to hold a place, you start with the ways in and out. The main door opened inward from the ramp, light metal with a wide glass pane, positioned right at eye level, making it a natural weak point. I tested the lock, then dragged the heaviest desk in front of it, and turned it sideways so its weight sat squarely on the legs. The windows along the walls were single pane and more framed than barrier glass is nothing to teeth or fists that no longer feel pain. A forgotten stack of scrap lumber lay piled against the back wall. I cut panels with a handsaw, screwed them over the inside of each window and watched the room darken with every board I tightened. At the top of each window, I left a gap just enough to let air move and to give me a narrow slit to look through. The light that slipped through those bands turned the room into a permanent late afternoon. Dull, but hard to see from outside. When the glass was no longer the weakest point, I turned to water and injuries. The problems that kill you slowly while you're worrying about everything else. The stockroom shelves held 3 orange buckets. I carried them down the ladder, dipped them in the inlet, and lined them against the far wall. The water wasn't clean enough to drink, but it provided a basic supply for washing and a raw reserve I could potentially treat later if things got desperate. An old first aid kit hung above the sink. I opened it, tossed anything that had leaked or turned to dust, and kept the sealed gauze tape and a few wrapped dressings. It wasn't much, but it was better than empty hands. Around midday, the radio cut in with a warning tone. The voice that followed declared a state of emergency and told people to stay in their homes, avoid groups, and report violent or strange behavior. They mentioned roadblocks on the highway and hospitals closing their doors. But one chilling line stuck with me more than any other. Do not approach anyone who appears injured and acts confused or aggressive. That was Dale at the gate, and those were the people in the shaky clips before the power died. It told me the danger was carried inside people who looked hurt and moved wrong, and that if they got close enough to bite or drag you down, no number on a screen would matter. Distance and barriers, I realized, would be my only real defense. As afternoon slid toward evening, I stopped just reacting and started treating the dockhouse like a place I might truly live. Instead of just waiting, I walked the floor, a slow, methodical circuit, checking for soft spots and marking mentally where every ladder and corner sat in the dim light. Under the hatch to the roof, I stacked 3 crates and laid a coil of line on top where my hand could find it in the dark. On the wall by the door, I hung a flashlight and the heaviest wrench in the room so I wouldn't be searching if metal ever started to ring. Light drained from the yard and turned the warehouse openings into dark squares. I shut off the radio to save power and sat with my back to the wall, facing the door and listening to the harbor settle into a silence you only hear on deep storm nights. That first night I slept in short bursts, waking at every creak and gust. Each time the boards over the windows held, the door stayed closed, and the only sounds were the water under the pilings and the wind batting the loose sign outside. Whatever chaos was unfolding beyond the inlet was undeniably larger than anything I could ever hope to fix. But inside this small building, perched on concrete legs, I had drawn my first crucial line in the new world, and I planned to hold it at all costs. Morning came as a grey smear through the gaps and the boards over the windows. No sunrise, just a slow brightening that said the world somehow was still there. The town side of the inlet stayed quiet, but quiet no longer counted as safety. It only meant whatever was wrong wasn't on my ramp just yet. Food had to come next. The cupboards held almost nothing. 2 mugs, old coffee, tea bags, some sugar. My truck, still sitting in the side lot, had a lunch cooler on the passenger seat. The thought of walking back up the ramp into open pavement made my neck itch. A prickle of unease. But starting with empty shelves would have been far worse. I watched the empty road between the warehouses from the narrow slit above the door. No cars, no people, just that heavy, watchful silence. I cracked the door, listened for any sound out of place, then stepped out with the keys clutched in my fist. The air smelled like cold metal and old salt. From the truck, I quickly grabbed the cooler, a duffel bag, my tool bag, and the camping stove from behind the seat. On the way back down, a siren rose somewhere in town, mixed with a horn, then cut off mid-note. A chilling abruptness. My feet took the last few steps faster, almost a run. Back inside, I emptied the cooler onto the counter. 2 bottles of water, 3 cans of soup, crackers, jerky, trail mix. Not much, a meager haul, but enough to stretch if I was careful. The camping stove ran on small fuel canisters. I had 3, a small comfort. I set it on bare metal by the sink and said aloud, "No flames with windows open. No cooking when the wind blows toward town." Saying it out loud made it a concrete rule. A line I would think twice about crossing. Power came next. The overhead light still worked, but trusting the yard's main electrical feed felt like standing on rotten planks over a chasm. I shut off every breaker except the one that fed a single outlet by the radio and unplugged the radio when I wasn't using it. From then on, light became something I chose, a deliberate act instead of something habit simply handed me. Late morning, a flicker of motion on the far side of the inlet pulled me to the south window. 3 figures ambled along the cracked pavement. At a distance, they could have been any work crew cutting between buildings, but their rhythm was profoundly wrong. One shuffled, one dragged a foot, one lagged, head tilted, staring off to the side. None of them spoke, their silence more unsettling than any scream. They bumped into a concrete block and kept moving unheeded. One hit a low chain, went down hard, lay still for a moment, then pushed up on stiff, unnatural arms, and slowly climbed to his feet while fresh blood smeared his sleeve. The other 2 never paused, never even turned. Watching from behind the boards, a cold dread settled in my chest, the same sickening drop I had felt at the gate with Dale bodies moving. Yes, but the mines are gone. Utterly gone. They never once looked toward the water. The 3 drifted listlessly between 2 warehouses and slipped out of sight. A few seconds later, a rough, dragging noise floated back, chillingly distinct, like someone trying to breathe through a blocked, ragged tube. My hand instinctively went to the heavy wrench by the door. Swinging it at something like that up close would have been pure suicide. But the familiar weight in my palm smoothed the frantic shake in my fingers, offering a strange, fleeting comfort. That short, terrifying run to the truck and that stark, clear look across the yard settled a question I hadn't wanted to answer, but now knew with chilling certainty roads were done for me. A dead option, even if they stayed open on a map. Out here on this sliver of concrete and wood, I had 1 ramp, 1 ladder, and a vast cold sheet of water between me and anything on foot. It was my prison and my fortress. The thought changed how I fundamentally saw the room, transformed its very purpose. I stopped counting hours and started counting days, even weeks. The dockhouse needed a rhythm, a heartbeat of routine. Mornings were for checking the yard and shoreline, topping off water supplies, and listening to the radio for any fleeting signal. Afternoons were dedicated to tightening hardware, fortifying weak points, and moving tools to where my hands could find them without light, even blindfolded if necessary. Evenings for a hot, solitary meal, and for writing down every observation, every sound, every terrifying detail I had witnessed. The outbreak was bigger than me, far bigger. What I could do, what I had to do, was claim this dockhouse, set a few absolute rules I could keep, and follow them until the noise died down, or until something reached the ramp, whatever came first. On that second day, with 3 shambling strangers moving wrong across the yard, and the sirens fading into memory, that narrow, desperate plan was enough for a little while. At least it had to be. By the third day, the Dockhouse felt less like a cage trapping me and more like a second skin, a layer of armor I was slowly forging. Fear still gnawed at my ribs, constant companion. But the rigid routine helped wake up. Listen, check outside. Fix one thing, write one thing down. A grim liturgy. Roof checks were paramount. I'd already oiled the screaming hinges so the hatch opened with a short, almost apologetic creak the wind could easily mask. From the roof, I could survey the entire inlet. The warehouses on my side, the scattering of houses on the far bank, the town silhouette rising behind them, and a thin, persistent strip of smoke on the inland horizon that never seemed to clear. Each sweep was identical, a meticulous ritual. I checked the ramp and lot for any moved vehicles, any telltale open doors or newly formed shapes, and kept a vigilant eye on the shoreline and road for anyone on foot. The familiar hum of trucks and highway traffic was utterly gone. In its place, piercing single sharp sounds, a horn, a distant bang, one short, desperate shout punctuated long, unsettling stretches of absolute silence. Water security climbed higher on the list every time the radio mentioned service interruptions. 3 buckets were merely a stopgap. Certainly not a safety net. I shimmied down the ladder, my hand searching the cold underside until it found the rim of a plastic barrel wedged tightly between the pilings. I dragged it up, rinsed it thoroughly, and rolled it into the corner, ready to fill, drop by slow drop. The next hours were devoted to mitigating small insidious dangers. A nail jutting up on a step, a loose board near the back door, a jagged crate edge at shin height, just waiting for an unwary moment. In the old world, with working clinics, you'd curse, get a bandage, and move on. Now, with hospitals turning people away, one bad cut could quickly prove fatal. So, I hammered nails flat, screwed boards down tight, and wrapped tape around any sharp corners. At midday, I turned the radio back on. The detached voice used the word outbreak as if it had always been a part of the lexicon and spoke of bites, sudden inexplicable violence, and the grim directive, do not approach. Even when family shelters and buses were listed, as long as possible, repeated like a hollow promise no one truly believed. None of the supposed pickup points were anywhere near the harbor. For a moment, I pictured myself joining one of those desperate lines, but then saw again the 3 shambling figures dragging themselves across the cracked pavement and heard the sirens mid-rise cut off. A chilling echo. A crowded bus suddenly sounded far less safe than a small fortified building with 1 ramp, 1 ladder, and water on 3 sides. Food was the next most pressing problem. The few cans in the cupboard would stretch, but not indefinitely. Standing exposed on the open dock with a fishing rod would instantly turn me into a conspicuous silhouette, an easy target. So, I devised a quieter approach. 2 hand lines rigged with sinkers and hooks from an old tackle box, baited with thin strips of precious jerky, went through a gap between the deck boards near a piling. From inside, I could keep an eye on the cords where they crossed the wood. If they tightened, I'd know something below was interesting. Hopefully a meal. Late that afternoon, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, spoiled smell from town. An odor that had no place on the clean, salty air of the water. I shut every crack I could reach, sealing myself in, deciding I'd gladly live with stale air if it kept that putrid smell outside. The day remained eerily quiet until dusk. I was at the desk, my pen scratching in the notebook when a sudden, clear shout cut across the yard. It wasn't the guttural breathing I'd heard before. This was a human voice, sharp and horseradish, undeniably calling for help. Instead, I forced myself to stand at the narrow window, fingers pressed against the plywood, and counted the seconds. The shout rose, broke into a full-throated scream, then stopped with such terrifying suddenness it felt profoundly wrong. A few agonizing seconds later, the distinct shuffle of several sets of slow dragging footsteps moved across the asphalt together. No engines, no more voices, just that dry, scraping sound receding between the buildings, fading into the encroaching darkness. That night, lying sleepless on the office floor, the notebook within arm's reach, that cut-off cry resonated louder in my head than the constant lull of the water under the dock. In the oppressive dark, I reached for the pen and added one more stark line to the rules carved into my mind. Do not open the door just because someone is yelling. If I ever tried to help anyone from this place, it would always have to be with wood, glass, and distance safely between us. Sleep came in fractured pieces after that night. Haunted by the cut-off scream, I dozed, then jerked awake, listening, straining for any scrape on the ramp, only to start the anxious cycle all over again. The only thing that kept me from pacing until dawn was treating my growing grim checklist like orders I couldn't ignore. On the fourth morning, a hand line sat taut against the deck, and a small bass thrashed on the surface as I reeled it in. Cleaning it and eating hot fish with crackers bought me at least one more day of reprieve before I'd have to think about breaking into anyone else's building for food. Around that point, a routine finally solidified. Roof check at first light. Brief radio checks twice a day. A few buckets of water hauled up. Each trip is a test of my balance and nerve on the swaying ladder. And an evening lap through the dark room so my feet knew every potential obstacle. Every turn, even if the lights failed completely. On what I'd grimly marked as day 5, a new sound cut through the quiet. Not a siren or a crash, but an outboard motor, high-pitched and sputtering. A rough cough against the silence, working its way up the inlet. I climbed to the roof and eased the hatch open just a crack, enough to peer out without revealing myself. A small aluminum skiff emerged from the bend in the main channel. A grey-bearded man worked the tiller. A woman in a raincoat braced herself in the bow, and a younger, uncertain passenger huddled low between them. All of them were clearly headed for the public pier on the far side, not my secluded little service dock. At first, that made sense. The public pier had proper ladders and a ramp leading straight to the street. But then I saw them. 3 figures already standing along the rail. They leaned at odd unnatural angles and didn't shift their weight like people simply waiting for a boat. Even from that distance, their unnatural stillness set at every nerve on edge. The man on the skiff spotted them far too late. He jerked the tiller handle, the motor coughed, then sputtered into silence, and the boat bumped up, piling, drifting helplessly sideways. The figures on the pier turned as one toward the sudden noise and began their slow, heavy, dragging walk across the pier boards. On the skiff, the woman spun around, her face a mask of panic, and yelled something at the man. The younger passenger lifted their head, a face pale and utterly blank. The man yanked at the starter cord again and got nothing but a pathetic wheeze. 10 more precious seconds of drift, and those hands on the pier would be close enough to grab the skiff's vulnerable hull. I had scant seconds, it felt like, to choose whether to stay invisible or act. The answer. A flicker of an idea hung on a hook by the office door. The truck keys with their red panic button. A bizarre relic meant for a crowded parking lot, not a dead haunted harbor. I scrambled down, snatching the keys, and stood at the narrow, boarded-up window that offered a partial view of the lot. The truck sat alone on the concrete beyond it. The 3 grim shapes on the pier continued their relentless advance toward the edge. I pointed the fob, took a deep, ragged breath, and pressed it hard. The horn hit the silent yard like a thunderclap. Loud, piercing headlights flashing maniacally off the warehouse metal siding and shattered glass across the water. Every shambling head on the pier snapped with unsettling anonymity toward the new jarring noise. They turned away from their previous prey and started their slow, relentless dragging walk back along the boards, now redirecting their twisted attention directly towards my lot. On the boat, the man didn't waste a single second of the opening I'd given them. He hauled the starter cord again with desperate strength, and this time the motor caught with a roar and blessedly stayed alive. The woman dropped low, pulling the younger passenger down with her, shielding them, and the skiff crept, then sped along the far edge of the marina, using the hulks of larger abandoned boats as cover until it slipped behind a warehouse and out of sight. I tapped the panic button one more time, a shorter, more controlled burst just to hold their attention while the skiff moved. The 3 in the lot reached the pavement and wandered in slow, shambling circles around my truck. One of them slapped both hands on the hood with a sickening thud. Another bumped its shoulder into the door hard enough to make the truck frame visibly rock. When I finally killed the blaring horn, the figures in the lot turned away. Their attention fractured and drifted aimlessly between buildings, chasing some new, perhaps imaginary sound deeper in town. My hands trembled violently. I had just used my only vehicle as bait and announced that this yard was not entirely deserted. It had worked, and 3 people I had never seen, never spoken to, were still drawing breath because of it. It also added a new line to the notebook. Sound was no longer just something to hide from, but a weapon, a tool I could aim and wield when needed. The skiff never came back. I told myself that was good, that if they didn't know where the horn came from, they couldn't give me up. But the inlet felt irrevocably changed after that. Hitting that red button had pushed my world outward, forced me to engage, and once you cross that line, sitting still while the food runs down stops feeling like a sustainable plan. I watched the warehouse from the roof for a full agonizing day before I dared to move. Side door, broken front glass, the strip of pavement between us, no movement, no new cars, nothing shambling or dragging in or out. Moving at night would have felt brave and suicidally stupid. So the next morning, I meticulously checked every latch, tightened the front brace, and left a small, almost superstitious note on the desk with the date and my intended destination. The walk was short, but it felt impossibly long and terrifyingly exposed. From the dockhouse to the warehouse side door was a scant 100 yards of cracked pavement, a wasteland of weeds with rusted dumpsters and precariously stacked old pallets offering only the thinnest, most unreliable cover. The sky felt vast and oppressive the second I stepped out. An unwelcome witness to my vulnerability. I stayed pressed close to the walls, one hand always on brick or cold metal, the gravel under my boots sounding impossibly, dangerously loud. The truck sat halfway between the buildings, a silent monument to my previous rashness. I didn't let myself stare at the dried smears on the hood and door. That horn blast was already a spent arrow, and nothing I did now would change what it had already drawn. I passed it, counted my steps, my breath held tight, and slid into the deep shade under the marine warehouse awning, with my pulse hammering a frantic rhythm in my ears. The front entrance was a chaotic mess of cracked glass and bent aluminum, easy to enter, but impossible to properly watch or secure. The side door under the awning still looked surprisingly intact. I tried the handle with 2 cautious fingers. Locked, of course. For a second, the scared, rational part of me screamed for retreat, treating that locked door as explicit permission to turn back. But then I pictured the untouched sealed meals inside, contrasting sharply with the few stale crackers I was rationing back in the dockhouse just 2 lots away. I pressed my ear to the cold metal and held my breath, straining to hear. No shuffle, no ragged breath, no faint hum from within. When the silence remained unnervingly flat, a heavy dead silence, I slid a short pry bar between the stubborn latch and the door frame, then leaned in with my full weight. The latch gave with a sharp echoing pop that seemed to rupture the stillness. I froze, counted a long, agonizing 30 beats, then eased the door open just enough to slip through the narrow gap. The air inside was thick and stale, a potent mix of stale rubber, fine dust, and the cloying scent of faint mildew, the signature smell of prolonged abandonment. Fingers of dim light from high-set windows sliced down in long dusty strips between the towering racks. No music, no drone of refrigerators, no humming coolers, just the faint irregular tick of metal somewhere deep in the roof structure. I let my eyes adjust and kept one hand trailing along the end of each shelf, counting the rows of forgotten goods as I moved cautiously toward where the camping display used to sit, my goal already fixed. Halfway there, a cold knot formed in my stomach as I saw the first undeniable sign that I wasn't the only one who'd thought of this place. A crushed cardboard display stand for lanterns lay toppled on its side. Beside it, a dark, ominous brown smear ran a short distance along the polished concrete toward the front, ending in a dry, flaked curl. A silent, sickening punctuation mark. No distinct footprints marred its surface, no wet shine, no lingering scent of decay. Whatever horrifying event had transpired, there were clearly days, perhaps weeks, old. The food aisle, surprisingly, looked almost untouched. Neat rows of meal packets and stacks of trail mix and energy bars still filling the shelves. I grabbed what I could reasonably carry and still made a swift escape. A sturdy box of mixed dehydrated meals, a couple of bags of high-calorie nuts and dried fruit, several dense energy bars, and a few small water bottles, wedging them tightly into my pack. I forced myself to leave the rest. Extra weight I knew was just another way to fall, another hindrance to survival. On the way back toward the side door, I made a detour down the first aid aisle. A hopeful detour. Most of the larger first aid kits were long gone, the hooks left bare or holding only faded price tags. But a small, unassuming red hard case still hung stubbornly on one peg. I snatched it without hesitation or a second thought, crammed it tightly under the flap of my pack, and hurried toward the precious strip of light that marked the cracked door. I was barely 3 steps from the exit when something hit the metal siding outside with a dull, resonant thud that sent a shiver through the very structure of the building and shook a fine powder of dust from the ceiling beams. The sound came again, slower, more deliberate, followed by a sickening dragging scrape along the concrete just beyond the wall. It was unmistakably clear. Whatever was out there had found this building, had been drawn in by my presence, and was now relentlessly working its way along the side, directly toward the only door I had left open. My last slender hope of escape. The worst part was how agonizingly slow the sound moved. If something had crashed straight into the door, I could have thrown the pry bar down, braced it, and waited. Instead, the weight hit the siding, slid, paused, and hit again. As if whatever it was, whatever remained of the thing, was blindly bouncing off the wall, feeling along it. Each pause felt longer than the last, as if it were waiting, listening, trying to pinpoint my exact location. Backing deeper into the aisle felt inherently wrong. But standing inches from the door felt equally as terrifying. So I slipped almost silently sideways into the next aisle, dropped to one knee, so my head remained below the sight line of the towering racks, and watched the thin band of light under the door. A shadow dragged past in that sickening 2 scrapes in a bump rhythm while the door handle just inches away groaned under unseen pressure. I set the pack down and quickly checked my meager arsenal. Pocket knife, pry bar, flashlight. No gun, of course. Never a gun. A fight here would quickly devolve into a desperate wrestling match with shelves on both sides and nowhere to go. And every safety talk I'd ever given screamed warnings about bottlenecks and blind corners in just such a scenario. Waiting for the latch to fail or for it to simply lose interest were the only 2 outcomes if I stayed put. And neither option sounded remotely intelligent. The sprawling warehouse thankfully had other exits. The broken front, a loading bay, an emergency fire door near the bathrooms, and the mental map etched in my mind insisted I could still make it back home if I cut across the rear of the building and slipped out through the emergency fire door. I carefully slid the pack back on and moved low, almost a crouch between the aisles, counting end caps as I went. I crept past dusty fishing gear, crumpled rain jackets, empty coolers, and a particularly unnerving row of propane canisters. I gave an extra wide berth, my hands hovering, careful not to brush anything that might roll or clank and give me away. At the far wall, a partially open doorway beckoned into a narrow, dimly lit hall where a faint, almost mocking exit sign glowed with the barest hint of life. Halfway down that hall, a faint but distinct rattle of glass from the front of the building echoed the earlier thuds. A sickening clink of broken window and twisted frame punctuated by a low, guttural, ugly sound that might once have been a human voice. Whatever creatures had found the side wall now had company, drawing more of their kind to the easier, more vulnerable opening. The fire door's push bar turned under my trembling hand without a fight. I eased it open an inch, saw only a narrow weed-choked strip of alley behind the warehouse, listened, heart pounding until I was certain the only sound was the wind, a lonely, indifferent whisper. Then I slipped out, letting the heavy door fall almost closed behind me with a muted click, while the glass still rattled faintly from the front, a grim lullaby. There was no easy straight line back to the Dockhouse from here. Cutting left risked a direct immediate encounter with whatever monstrosity had been blindly feeling along the wall, while going right meant a significantly longer loop. An exposed sprint across an open lane before I could even hope to reach my lot. But the longer path, I quickly decided, kept more precious concrete and thick metal between me and the encroaching, hungry noise. I moved cautiously along the backs of the properties, my shoulder almost brushing the grimy walls, skirting towering scrap piles and rusted skeletal cages, stepping carefully over hoses gone stiff and brittle with age. Twice a sudden gust of wind shoved loose trash across the alley in a way that sounded uncannily like shuffling footsteps. And both times my heart leaped into my throat only to find it was just plastic or a crumpled sheet of paper. At the end of the row, the alley abruptly opened into a wider exposed service yard. From the relative safety of that shadow, I could see the narrow, crucial lane that led toward my lot, a stark strip of asphalt sandwiched between two unforgiving cinder block walls, with the inlet gleaming faintly at the far end. My eyes frantically scanned the ramp, the familiar outline of the truck, and the reassuring boarded front of the dockhouse until I was absolutely sure nothing moved, nothing stirred. The bad news, a fresh wave of dread, was that the noise from the front of the marine warehouse had grown distinctly louder. Metal and glass rattling in frantic bursts, mixed with that thick, guttural, ugly sound that barely passed for a voice. Something out there, some things, had clearly found a new horrifying reason to keep pushing. And I absolutely didn't want to be visible, exposed. When the last of that tortured frame finally gave way, there was no time left for finesse or deliberation. I took one ragged breath to steady my legs, picked a desperate straight line down the center of the lane, and simply ran for the dock lot. The pack thumped a frantic rhythm against my back, and every primal instinct I possessed screamed at me not to trip. Not here, not now, not ever. The run back felt longer than the walk out, even though my boots hit the same cracks. The sun baked the lane into a bright blur, and with every stride, I expected a head to swing into view by the warehouse, proving I'd miscounted. Nothing stepped out. I crossed the open stretch just short of a sprint and cut into the dockhouse lot where the truck ramp and board sat as before untouched. Going straight inside would have been easy and wrong. I pressed my back to the wall, edged to the corner, and looked toward the marine warehouse. From here, I saw only the side wall and awning edge. Heard glass rattle, frame scrape, and something deep inside crack under a shift of weight. Whatever was over there had made it through. That building now belonged to the noise I'd invited. The thought landed once my pulse slowed. By touching it, I'd woken a structure that might have stayed off the map for weeks. Out here, survival wasn't hiding from what exists. It was choosing which places you woke up by needing what they hold. Every latch you force is another beacon, and you never know who will answer it first. I made myself move. The main doors took both hands to pull shut without a slam. Rope braces slid into place and the lock seated with a solid click. Inside, the air smelled like dust, plastic, and fish. The pack went on the table and my head flipped from outside scan to inside count. Food came first. Dehydrated meals, trail mix, bars, piles I could turn in 2 days. At 2 simple meals and some fish, those shelves meant weeks. It felt less like stealing food and more like stealing time from a clock I couldn't see. The red first aid case opened with a stiff snap and gave me bandages, gauze, wrap, scissors, gloves, and small packs of basic pills. I set it with my old kit and taped a note above. Small cuts turned big, fast, clean, cover, check. Only then did I climb to the roof. The inlet lay flat and grey, slips empty, gulls coasting over the markers. From up there, I could see the warehouse front. The glass doors had been shoved wide, and dark streaks along the frame showed where bodies forced their way through. 3 figures hovered in the opening, moving with that wrong jerky rhythm, one bumping its shoulder, another staring up with its mouth open. One kept turning in a loop. No one living would be using that lobby soon. Anyone who tried would be walking into a nest I'd helped build, and the thought sat heavy, even though the other option had been staying behind my boards and watching the last cans vanish. Every choice now was a trade, and none of the trades came clean. When the lot stayed quiet, I logged it with one new rule. Every building you touch becomes a signal. Touch only what you must. Sleep came in short slices. When it finally pulled me under, the factory scream was gone. Now I walked rows of bays and doors. Each time a pry bar bit into metal and a door swung open, a wave of slow bodies rolled in. Later, drawn by noises I couldn't hear. I woke up with my hands clenched and my forearms aching like I'd been hanging from a ledge. Instead of chasing more sleep, I sat at the table and broke the new food into 3 piles with marker labels. Base, travel, later. Calling the third one later instead of spare kept my head pointed toward a future where choices still mattered. Morning came in grey layers, fog low over the inlet, and through the binoculars the warehouse shapes were gone, replaced by a dark patch inside the doorway. Farther out, a small hull moved in the fog, low and steady, its motor barely a murmur. It wasn't the same skiff, but the sight of any boat out there tightened the same place in my chest. The red panic button from my hidden roof with fresh supplies in a warehouse turned the nest 2 lots over. It felt less like we were hiding from the end and more like we were nudging its edges in the dark. That thought stayed with me. The boat in the fog didn't come closer to my dock. It stayed out near the channel markers, moving slow enough that whoever steered it took their time studying each slip and ramp without making it overtly obvious. Through the binoculars, I watched, trying to read intent from posture alone. A surefire way to start telling yourself stories that may not be true. My fingers ached, cramping around the binoculars. 2 figures occupied the small hull. One handled the tiller while the other, constant presence, kept a hand on the bow rail, their head sweeping in short, controlled arcs. They weren't sightseeing. Their actions were deliberate, checking corners, counting ladders, scanning windows just long enough to detect movement. They never once looked straight at my dockhouse, a subtle avoidance that told me they knew better than to stare directly at the places that truly worried them. The motor's rumble remained low, barely above idle. Instead of running a clean, direct line down the channel, they adopted my own rhythm. Drifting, nudging forward, drifting again, listening to the harbor as much as watching it. The pattern matched my habits on land. You don't walk right up to any door without feeling out the space around it first. Watching them navigate the water felt eerily like seeing my own cautious approach mirrored from the outside. A part of me, the old impulsive part, wanted to test them, perhaps with a sudden flash off a mirror or a subtle shift on the roof. Another, more rational part, remembered vividly what had happened the last time I'd sent a signal, and how the warehouse, 2 lots over now, belonged to things that didn't care why I'd opened the door. In the end, I stayed low, hunkered behind the parapet, and let the small boat slide east into the thickening fog, its motor fading slowly into the general background hum of the harbor. When they vanished completely, the quiet felt different, changed, less like emptiness and more like the charged pause between radio stations, when you know other voices exist, active, but just beyond your current tuning. Back inside the 3 meticulously labeled piles on my table, base travel later felt less like private optimistic labels and more like a concrete desperate plan. The rest of the day I walked restless loops checking the lot and ramp, then meticulously inspecting my rooms as if seeing them for the first time, like a stranger trying to map out every potential stand or escape route. Some truths I found had subtly shifted. The plywood now showed faint, almost imperceptible stains where the relentless sea air had pushed in and dried sand-filled coolers previously sturdy had settled, leaving small, alarming gaps that might betray my position by leaking light at night. Fibers in one critical rope brace had started to fray, worn thin from being tightened and loosened too many times, a silent warning. None of it would likely fail today, but waiting passively for the inevitable was asking to be catastrophically surprised. So with grim determination, I tightened screws, retied knots, shifted weight onto solid framing, and stapled top along vulnerable edges. This simple, repetitive work steadied me better than any self-taught talk or grand speech ever could. That night, with a fresh surge of resolve, I added another stark rule to the crude cardboard tacked above my table. Boats, watch twice, signal once, and only if absolutely cornered. The first time I saw a hull, I would meticulously study it. The second time, I would calmly decide if its appearance constituted a pattern or merely a one-off event. Only if that pattern explicitly boxed me in, leaving no other recourse, would I ever risk waving a light or raising my voice. 2 days later, the familiar small hull returned, this time with no concealing fog for cover. Late morning sun hit the water so fiercely that the little boat appeared to float effortlessly on glass. Same size, same motor, same 2 shapes. Yet their movements were noticeably slower, more deliberate. The bow watcher's head no longer swept in neat, methodical arcs. Instead, it stopped, lingered on certain docks, and subtly tilted at details they clearly didn't like. They circled wide near the ruined silent factory, paused briefly at a private marina, and then inexorably kept coming. A low, unsettling buzz vibrated in my teeth. As they finally reached my stretch of harbor, the tiller hand throttled down to almost nothing, and the motor barely rippled the placid surface. The person at the bow slowly turned toward my side of the inlet, holding their gaze there, noticeably longer than on their first pass. They still didn't look directly at the dockhouse, but their focus was undeniably near it, and near is sometimes all a truly careful eye needs. For the first time since the outbreak began, the cold comfort of maybe no one sees me fractured, shifting abruptly to the unnerving reality of maybe someone does. Lying flat and motionless on the roof, I knew then that my silence, my very invisibility was now a conscious, deliberate choice, an act of defiance. For a long time after the boat passed, I lay flat on the roof and listened to my pulse slow down. The harbor went back to its usual sounds. Small waves lapping against pilings, gulls crying somewhere out on the channel, a loose metal tap echoing across the water. But none of it felt harmless anymore. Every noise now had a possible owner, potential intention. And some of those owners had just watched my shoreline, then deliberately kept going. By late afternoon, the sun had dropped behind the towering warehouses, turning the inlet into a blinding strip of glare. I stayed off the roof and worked downstairs, not because anything was overtly urgent, but because I didn't want my head silhouetted against the fading sky if that little hull decided to make another unexpected pass. Fuel levels got checked. The generator box got another careful listen. And the antenna received a small, almost superstitious adjustment that probably changed little if anything, but kept my hands purposefully busy. Sleep came in short, shallow pieces. Twice I woke, convinced a small motor was idling right outside the dock, only to find it was just the wind humming in a loose vent cover. The second time I quit pretending, brewed coffee on the camp stove, and made my way back up before dawn. Usually, first light paints the mast tops, then the roofs, then the water. This time, the first true change I saw was a narrow probing beam on the far side of the inlet. A tight, piercing strip of white light swept once along a concrete wall near the private marina, skimming low to the water, then abruptly clicked off. 10 seconds later, it swept the same precise arc again. No street lamp I knew moved with that kind of deliberate searching pattern. Someone over there was awake early, using light as deliberately as I used mirrors for surveillance. I watched that patch of shore until the sky went grey and nothing else moved. Then immediately logged a new rule. If you see a pattern twice, treat it as real. The hull didn't come back that day or the next. 2 days of what I'd come to call ordinary fear. Distant shapes, creaking boards, almost convinced me they were just passing through. On the fourth morning, the radio abruptly knocked that idea flat. Halfway through my scan, a voice crackled out of static on a channel that had been dead for weeks. Mid-harbor watchers, a woman's voice announced, thin but surprisingly steady. If you're out there, we see your boards. We're not looking to share walls, just wondering where the dead stack thickest. The message repeated precisely every minute for 5 excruciating minutes and then just as abruptly stopped. No call sign, no coordinates, no names, just that enigmatic phrase dropped into the vast open air. Mish Harbor Watchers. The hand mic hung temptingly within reach, but I left it there instead. I carefully wrote the words down, translating them in my head. They know somebody fortified a dock. They aren't trying to move in. They want information, not shelter. And they knew where to look. For the next hour, I kept the volume low, and the antenna meticulously pointed toward the private marina where I'd seen that probing light. Nothing else came through. No follow-up, no direct threat, no plea. Whoever she was, she seemed content to let the message hang in the air. A baited hook waiting to see who would bite. I wasn't ready to be that voice. So, I let silence speak volumes and retreated to stacking small critical gear, flares, spare batteries, filters into crates in the storage room. That was when the unmistakable thrum of an outboard at low throttle began to creep through the walls. It wasn't the ragged rev of someone running flat out or the full desperate roar of a boat sprinting across open water. No, this was the steady, controlled hum of people who valued precision and control far more than raw speed. From the roof, I found the inlet clear and bright, and the same small hull, unmistakable, sliding in from the east in no hurry at all. They worked the water with the same calculated precision as before, pausing near certain docks, letting the hull drift almost silently, then nudging it along with practiced ease. When they reached an empty slip 2 down from mine, the tiller hand decisively cut the engine and let momentum carry them silently to the bumper. No one jumped up in haste. Both heads turned slowly, methodically, reading the silent, boarded-up row of doors. Then the bow rider stood, a figure of calm authority. They reached into their jacket and slowly, deliberately lifted a handheld radio to waist height, where the glint of metal caught the late morning light. It was a clear, quiet signal. They preferred to talk before they even thought about stepping onto a stranger's wood. For a moment, no one moved. The two in the boat watched the line of slips. I watched them from the roof. Small waves lapped gently at the bumpers, and the cooling motor ticked a steady rhythm. My rifle lay propped against the parapet within easy reach, its barrel angled away, safety engaged. Pointing it now would turn this into a very different conversation. The boat rider sat, a handheld radio clutched in both hands, held high enough that anyone watching would certainly notice. That radio glowing faintly in the morning light was the clearest message I'd seen in weeks. I had won. They had won, too. If they'd meant to rush the dock, they would have come in hot. Throttle wide open, hands empty, ready to board. Cutting the engine 2 slips down and openly displaying electronics instead of metal meant something else entirely. A test or an offer. I slid back from the edge until the roof completely hid me and pulled my own handheld from its charger ready. The screen still showed the channel where that woman's voice had been. I dialed back to it, raising the plastic mic to my mouth, but not yet pushing the transmitter below. The bow rider turned subtly toward the inlet and pressed her button. Mid-harbor watcher. Her voice crackled, clear but concise. Slip 23. 2 aboard. We stayed in the boat. You stay right where you are. If you want to talk, key up once. If not, we're gone. She released the button. Static hissed into the momentary gap, saying nothing would send them away, leaving me to my isolation. Saying too much might turn this dock into a target on somebody else's list, exposing me to unknown threats. Somewhere between those 2 points sat the part of me that still craved knowledge about what the rest of the harbor looked like. What was out there? I pressed the transmit button once, a brief sharp pulse, and released it without speaking a word. 1 click, nothing more. Small in my ear, but a deafening roar in my chest. Copy. 1 click, she acknowledged a moment later. Call sign Harbor 3. 2 aboard Rhea and Noah. We ran out of the North Terminal fuel yard. Small crew running small boats. We map where the dead congregate and which channels remain usable. We're not here for your walls. We want your eyes. I eased back to the parapet, letting just enough of my head rise to observe them. My hand kept the radio pressed close to my ear. The hull still sat motionless 2 slips away. Noah sat, both hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady. Rhea held the radio on her thigh, shoulders loose, but inherently ready. I keyed my mic, this dock stays closed, I said, my voice deliberately flat. You don't step foot on it without an invitation. You don't bring more than 2 people aboard your boat, and you don't bring trouble you picked up somewhere else. You can talk from that spot, and that's the only access you get. Understood, she replied, her voice calm and level. We don't like surprises either. You're the only boarded-up dock around that isn't smoking or roaring with activity, so you're definitely on our short list. When I asked what list, she said, people who might still be thinking. We run a regular loop. Fuel yard, ferry pier, East Marina, river lock. Most spots we check are burned out or have gone completely quiet. A few look like this. We're asking 2 things. Where are the biggest clusters of the infected? And what are you short on that we can potentially carry? I glanced at my logbook beside the radio. A meticulous record full of dates and observations about wind and tide. You think you know this stretch already? I asked, a hint of challenge in my voice. She rattled off her intel. The factory at the north end routinely spits walkers when sirens wail inland. The supermarket lot on the hill is a known congregation point, and the pier with the red crane stays mostly clear, especially after that long fire. She paused, then added, "What we don't know is how many reach your slips or when the last major wave hit you." I gave her my grim numbers. Most nights, 3 to 5 bodies drift in on the calm water from the west, catching on broken ladders and bent rails until some ambient noise eventually pulls them further on. I paused, letting that sink in. But 8 nights ago, round midnight, a wave of maybe 40 moved through in 2 hours, as if something had actively pushed them out from behind the factory. Aboard the skiff, Noah's head snapped up at the mention of 40. Rhea merely nodded. That fits our intel. The hardware store went loud that night. We watched a herd peel off toward your side of the inlet. She had her first crucial answer. You said you had 2 questions, I reminded her, keeping my tone level. What's on the table for the second one? Rhea reached under her seat and brought up a small watertight dry bag. Start a trade, she announced. 3 courses of broad-spectrum antibiotics, water test strips, and a marked street map highlighting hot blocks and confirmed empties. We'll toss it to the empty slip between us. Then we're gone. Nobody steps closer. It felt like a fair exchange for a handful of harbor notes. Throw it, I instructed, but use a rope. No hero jumps. Noah deadly looped a line through the bag's handle, swung it once with surprising precision, and sent it in a low, controlled arc that easily cleared the gap. It landed on the dock boards with a dull, satisfying thump. Are you going to give us a name? Rhea asked, her voice expectant. Dockhouse, I replied, my voice firm. I'll listen at dawn and an hour before dark, but only if it stays quiet. 2 per boat, no screaming engines. And if you think you're followed, you stay clear. That's the deal. Copy that, Dockhouse, she confirmed. Harbor 3 will check in at those 2 windows. Our protocol, if we're coming in friendly, we cut the engine at the channel markers and drift the rest of the way. If we ever hit your stretch hot, meaning we're under pursuit or compromised, and then suddenly kill the motor, it means we're pushed. If that happens, you stay dark, completely dark. No matter what we shout or what you hear, we'll drag the problem somewhere else, away from you. It was the first offer since the outbreak that sounded like a genuine, practical plan rather than a desperate, hopeful prayer. Fair enough, I agreed. A flicker of something almost like respect in my gut. You keep your side of the bargain and I'll keep my eyes open. You don't. And this dock goes completely dark permanently. Understood, she affirmed, meeting my gaze directly. She tapped Noah's shoulder, and he brought the engine back to life with a short, practiced pull. The hull eased away from the bumper, turned in a slow, deliberate arc, and idled smoothly toward the main channel. I watched until they were just another indistinct shape swallowed by the mist, then climbed down and stepped cautiously onto the boards for the dry bag. It had a surprising, comforting weight. Medicine, paper, and concrete proof that my carefully crafted rules now existed beyond the confines of my own mind, etched onto somebody else's route. The dry bag felt heavier than it should as I carried it inside. Antibiotics rattled in their packs. The test strip sat in a small case and a rolled map pressed against my palm. This wasn't a present. It felt like work. On the bench, I spread everything out. Pills went into a labeled tin strips into the water kit the map last. Beneath the new markings, it was the familiar city grid overlaid on that was a chilling second layer. Red blocks, heavy, blue, thin circles for clinics, fuel yards, posts, depots, some crossed as burned. At the bottom, my harbor was a narrow band with a triangle and a question mark over my dock. The fuel yard marked H3 and the riverlock tagged bridge. For 2 days, the water remained calm. Bodies still drifted into the outer pilings on calm nights, and the same strip of loose metal clicked at 3 o'clock in the morning. I kept my routine fixed on purpose. Dawn sweep, check water and fuel, tighten one thing and listen on the radio only at our 2 windows. On the 3rd morning, the pattern broke. Harbor 3 to Dockhouse. Rhea's voice crackled. Morning sweep. We've got 40, maybe 50, leaving the supermarket ridge on the truck route. Moving slow. They'll hit the North Piers in a couple hours. Expect bodies drifting past you around midnight. I answered with a single copy, then walked the dock, checked braces, dragged more sand-filled coolers to the front, and cleared tools from the doors. Her call told me more than the count. To see a herd come off that ridge and know where it would land, they needed height. A spotter or both. Harbor 3, I realized, was more than one boat. It was an organized, capable operation, making them both useful and risky. Around midnight, her forecast turned real. Shapes knocked along the harbor wall in slow clumps pushed by a light breeze that slid them over ladders and pilings. From my viewing slit, I counted 5, 9 more. The current kept them from stacking at my dock, but they were close enough that one dropped wrench could have turned the line in. At dawn, I passed Rhea the time and a rough number. "Got it," she said. "We'll swing up the river around that window." The radio shifted in my mind from strange comfort to simple tool. A week later, they came back slow, engine cut at the markers, drifting into the same neighboring slip. Rhea held up a laminated card. "Harbor code," she said. "If you need us to stay out without talking, hang this where we can see it and tilt it. 3 arrows along one edge. Down for shore hot, sideways for harbor hot, up for place lost." I tucked the card by the roof hatch. We never traded full histories. From their comments, I learned she'd run ferries and trucks, that Noah talked about gates and flows the way others talk about family. They learned I knew these pilings and cranes that I counted instead of guessed and wrote things down. Even when nothing dramatic happened, it was enough. The first time Harbor 3 came in wrong, every rule I'd made wanted to jump ship. It was a flat grey afternoon a few weeks later, rain hanging offshore in a pale curtain. The evening window passed with no call. Half an hour later, I was on the roof watching the inlet when I heard an engine I could feel in my teeth. Their hull burst out of the haze at the channel mouth. Bow high, motor screaming. Along the far sea wall, a broken line of bodies clung and stumbled after them. Too many arms reaching Noah killed the motor at the outer markers, and the hull rode its own wake in. Every part of me wanted to wave them into my slip. Rhea's hand stopped me as she snapped it toward the sea wall. "Dockhouse Harbor 3, she said, breathing short but steady. Pushed off the lock. Big pack on the wall. We're cutting past and out the east channel. Stayed dark and let them chase what we already gave them." From the roof, I watched the herd shift toward that old noise. Even with the engine silent, they followed its path along concrete while Harbor 3 swung wide and slid past. They cleared the last marker and disappeared into the haze. The pack went after them, closing on the outlet instead of my boards. When the sea wall finally emptied, I realized my hands hurt from gripping the parapet. That night, I squeezed one more line onto the rule board. "If Harbor 3 comes in hot and cuts wide, you are scenery." It looked stupid beside notes about water filters and fuel, but it made sense. Some days the right move is to stay out of someone else's plan. After that, days and nights settled into a rhythm. Dawn and dusk windows when the band was quiet. Single bursts when it wasn't. East Marina burned. Diesel at River 7. No flame. Bridge group down 1. Still talking. In return, I passed what you notice when you stare at one piece of water. How sound carries which roofs sag where fresh paint shows on doors. The dockhouse itself didn't change. It stayed quiet, boarded, wired, ready. I still slept with boots close and a rifle in reach. I still checked ladders for new scrapes and wiped prints off rails I hadn't used. The difference sat outside my walls. Before Harbor 3, if I vanished, this slip would fade into the harbor's dead space. With them running their loop, at least 2 people would notice when Dockhouse went quiet. In a world that erased whole streets overnight, that thin thread of we know you're there felt like another layer of defense. One built from memory instead of plywood and screws. Really, if you enjoyed the story, please like, subscribe, and comment where you're listening from. See you in the next.